Second now. Here we go. Good evening, afternoon, everybody. This is the one some of you have been waiting for. We are going to be talking about Sainte-Mère-Église. Now, before I introduce our guest, many of you watching have been to Normandy. If you haven't been to Normandy, it's certainly on your bucket list. There are maybe half a dozen absolutely iconic sites in Normandy that when you see them, they say D-Day to you. The cemeteries, of course, the artificial harbour at Airborne, I think would count in that, the cliffs at Pointe du Hoc, Pegasus Bridge, and the one we're going to talk about is when you arrive into Sainte-Mère-Église via bus or minibus or in your car and you drive in there, about the first thing you see is a parachute and a mannequin hanging from the church tower facing the square where the public are. Then the museum is over there. And Marty and myself, I'll introduce Marty in a minute, have been guiding for years. Between us, we've taken probably tens of thousands of clients on tours. And as you turn the corner, whether you mention it or not, someone will mention, oh, there's the guy from the film. And they often get the actor's name wrong. I've heard various suggestions of who it was up there. It was Red Buttons playing Private First Class John Steele in The Longest Day movie. And then you have to talk about it. And what we're going to do today is talk about the actual real story, or what we can understand as the real story of what happened in that square on the night of June the 5th, 6th, 1944. So my guest, Martin K.A. Morgan. Marty, numerous books, numerous tours, numerous magazine articles, numerous TV appearances. We've known each other a long time. So good afternoon, Marty. Are you ready for this?
I am ready. Let's dig in.
So basically, my little introduction there is what we're talking about. We are talking about an event that has become bigger than the story, in that it is iconic, it's legendary. You can buy little models in the church of the parachute on the side of the church, this, that, and the other. It's become bigger than the story. And I have to say, I watch The Longest Day every year because I kind of refresh myself in it. And some of it, I read things, I look at my phone or whatever. The one scene that I actually find mesmerizing is the Sainte-Mère-Église square scene. Even though I question things about it, it is perfectly shot, it's perfectly paced. The sound of the bells, the lighting, the rat-a-tat of the machine guns, I find myself looking up there, and the moment the knife gets dropped, all that, I'm hooked. And then when it's over again, I kind of go back to my phone again. I also do it for the glider landing at Pegasus Bridge. They're the two moments I think I'm gripped. So what we're going to do today is we're going to try and unravel this and go back to what really happened. And I'm going to let you talk in a minute, Marty. Basically, both of us independently and then together have told more different versions of this story than we care to remember. We've tried to fit things together. We've tried to please our clients. We've tried to fit in with time frames and schedules. And over the years, you just realize you get deeper and deeper into a quagmire of confusion. And what you did, and that's why you're on, is you basically, well, I'll let you explain, you kind of stripped it back and said, let's pretend we don't know about the film. Let's pretend we don't know about the museum and the mannequins and the souvenirs. Let's build this story up again right from the beginning. But again, before I let you talk, I want to say to everybody watching, both Marty and I, we've talked about this. We've had messages sent to us saying perhaps we shouldn't be doing this. Perhaps we're being insulting to the memory of veterans. Both Marty and I have met numerous veterans over many years. I don't think anyone can question our respect for that generation and understanding what those guys did. And everybody who jumped out of an aircraft over Normandy that morning, everybody who was in Sainte-Mère-Église, be they French, German, American, has our respect for being part of a mammoth event in world history. And what we are doing is simply trying to understand what happened there. We're not casting any aspersions. We're not calling anybody out. We're just saying there are some contradictions with this account, and that's it. So, Marty, yeah, I've said a bit, but when a few years ago did you realize this needs to go back to big and we need to start this again?
Gosh, it's been almost 10 years ago now. At the time, I was leading tours for a company called Stephen Ambrose Tours. And as a result of that, I was frequently having to go to Sainte-Mère-Église. As you know, my interest is in the 507th Parachute Infantry Regiment, and that means I've got kind of an emphasis on things that happened out to the west of Sainte-Mère-Église. And I haven't been, and I never will be a 505th historian, but I was then, despite all of that, called on in every tour to tell the story of John Steele and what happened in Sainte-Mère-Église. And I think, like many guides, when I first began telling the story, I told what I now call the popularized version, what I call, sometimes I even call it assembly number one, because in TV and editing, we'll discuss assembly one, assembly two, assembly three, and then final cut. And that's basically the movie version. And my overall argument here, and I'll tie up everything I have to say basically into one sentence, and that is, every single piece of evidence that supports the traditionalized version of this story, which is John Steele hanging from the bell tower and everything depicted in that scene in the movie, all of that is based on personal accounts only. Every single personal account contradicts every other personal account. There is absolutely no evidence whatsoever, aside from personal accounts, supporting the traditional Assembly One version of this story. And my argument overall is that I think the story was turned into something big by the movie, and we now have, it became so big that everyone pays attention almost exclusively to that. And I have a big argument about that, in that about 1,000 feet to the north of where this happened is the site of the John Ashley Distinguished Service Cross action, which I never get to talk about. I never get to take tourists to the site where that happened. It's a dramatic and fascinating and well-documented event. It's got photographs that support it. It's got a Distinguished Service Cross citation. Ashley didn't survive the war, but we know a lot about what he did there. And it is almost entirely outside of the narrative of what happened on June 6th and June 7th in Sainte-Mère-Église. We focus exclusively on the scene that's depicted in the movie, to the neglect of stories like the John Ashley story. And I think we should reverse that, because I find the Ashley story to be, it's more interesting in a way, but it's also something that's documented very well. And there are just no contradictions associated with it. That was more than one sentence, but you get my point.
Yeah, and then there's Waverley Ray and Turner Turnbull, and you know, it goes on and on about the lists of people who were involved in actions within spitting distance of that church that are more deserving, or at least as deserving, equally deserving of attention. So let's go back to what we've got a lot of whole points to go through, and you've analyzed with a fine-tooth comb these accounts of people. When I was running my bigger tour company 10 years ago, I remember I wasn't very good with Excel documents, but I made this kind of graph thing up, and I had key moments like, machine gun fire starting, parachutes landing, and I did the same thing. I took all the personal accounts I had, and I tried to make any columns line up, and none did. Not the times, not the directions, not the way they're facing, nothing lined up whatsoever. So we just, okay, well, we need to go there. The museum is important. We've discussed it at length. There's bathrooms there, there's souvenir shops there. It's a convenient place on the way to Utah Beach. We go there, and then you have to make sense of the John Steele story in some shape or form. And of course, the windows in the church are definitely worth seeing. Outside of anything else, they're beautiful, and the respect the French show for what happened is worth pointing out. And you got the Roman road marker, and there's some great photos to match up there. But whose account are we going to start? Let's start with the main man. Let's start with PFC John Steele and what he actually said, and how he came to submit that to Cornelius Ryan for The Longest Day. So run through what he said, if you wouldn't mind, please.
14 words. All of this began with 14 words. As Cornelius Ryan was preparing to write this book that will ultimately become The Longest Day, he had first had the objective of releasing the book on the 10th anniversary. He didn't make that. He formed a partnership with Reader's Digest magazine that provided him some clerical and secretarial support to get the research work done. He shot for the 15th anniversary, which he made it for. And as a part of the greater research effort associated with the book, he sent out these questionnaires. And I know you've read them all, and I know you've seen them, but in the event that people that might be listening or watching aren't familiar with the questionnaires, these questionnaires really provide us with a kind of a fascinating snapshot of the way the veterans were thinking about the events that unfolded on June 6th, the way that they were thinking about it in circa 1958, circa 1950, 57, 58, really, around the time of Sputnik, the way that they were telling their June 6th story. And so John Steele submitted a questionnaire. And that questionnaire, I'm going to read it since it's just 14 words. That questionnaire included a question that said, "Where were you at midnight on June 6th, 1944? To which John Steele responded with the words, "Hanging from church steeple under eaves of church in Sainte-Mère-Église." There is absolutely no evidence that I have discovered of him prior to the movie articulating that story or explaining that story or creating any kind of version of that story. A point that I should make is that there's another question in the questionnaire. The questionnaire, I think, is 22 questions overall. And there's another question a little bit further down that read, "Do you remember seeing or hearing anything that seems funny now, even though it may not have seemed funny at the time?" And Steele responded with a story of after he had been captured and was a prisoner of war. He was being moved from one place to another place. And a German officer steps out, stops him, and in perfect English tells him, "So you can't run fast." He takes out a knife. He cuts through his belt and the button fly of his trousers and said that he did that so that you can't run fast. And Steele provides that response to that question and spends 94 words explaining what happened. So to Steele, it's strange to me that Steele, in 14 words that reads almost like a telegram. It's like it's leaving out articles and leaving out other connective words, very stripped down, and 14 words hanging from the church steeple. And then he spends a great deal more time explaining this other story about being a prisoner. So that's where it all started. And I should just mention that you've led into this, but a reason that I began tracing this to source code is that I found myself as a tour guide taking people to Sainte-Mère-Église, and I found it difficult for me to reconcile and accommodate of a cast of characters and what they all had to say about the event. I don't even know that it's important anymore to determine whether or not it actually even happened, because I feel like that doesn't matter anymore. What does matter, though, is that you cannot use any of the other voices in concert with Steele and make the stories work together. There is no no single narrative is possible for this story, because we're at step one at this point, where we're just talking about Steele and what he had to say about it, and we haven't gotten to this additional cast of characters yet. But the additional cast of characters have this effect of piling on to the story, and each one adds further complication and distortions to the story that make it impossible to settle on this singular narrative that I'm mentioning. And that singular narrative began for John Steele with 14 words. And Cornelius Ryan will take that 14 words, and I'm going to sound like a nerd here, but I think it's worth knowing, and that is that in the book The Longest Day, before the movie comes out, and when the book is released, Cornelius Ryan explains what John Steele explained in 14 words, only Cornelius Ryan uses 334 words to explain it. And so it's painfully obvious to me when I reveal that singular fact that Cornelius Ryan, who, although we recognize him for being a well-known author of nonfiction, he was a fiction writer. He used the journalistic style, which sometimes means that you add a little bit in and you expand on the story. And I believe that when you attempt to reconcile 14 words versus 334 words, you have to acknowledge the fact that there's been a significant amount of filling in. Now, when I first recognized that there was a big difference in size of John Steele's version and Cornelius Ryan's version, I then realized, I immediately thought maybe they had maybe they had a conversation, because maybe as these questionnaires came in, Ryan flagged them, in fact, on the John Steele questionnaire, which is available on the internet. But I'm sure you have it. But anybody who wants it, just reach out to me. I'm happy to provide it and all of the other information related to this. I thought maybe there was a possibility that Ryan picked up the phone and called Steele and chatted with him. And for many years, I just kind of wrote it off to that. Well, these guys obviously had a chat at some point, and John Steele went into greater detail, and Cornelius Ryan wrote the 334 words based on the greater detail from a phone call. I thought that at least until then, eventually, John Steele writes a letter to Cornelius Ryan on March 22nd, 1960. And in that letter, he asks Cornelius Ryan to provide an autographed copy of The Longest Day, the book. The movie's not out yet. And in reading this letter, which I'll send to you, if you don't already have it, you might already have it. I don't think people have seen it because I just got this letter last year.
Yeah, I don't have it.
Ohio University. Yeah, I'll send it to you. It's very interesting. It's very short, but in reading it, it is painfully obvious that these two men have not spoken to each other. That John Steele is, in the first sentence of the letter, he's explaining who he is, then he's explaining that he wants a book. And it's very obvious to me that they haven't spoken. It seems to me very powerfully that they have not talked to one another, and that Cornelius Ryan took 14 words, turned it into 334 words. And then I think a critical part of this story is that then Darryl F. Zanuck, who is making the movie and using Cornelius Ryan up until the point where Cornelius Ryan was fired and cast out of the movie production. Zanuck, who turned everything over to screenwriters that at one point involved Cornelius Ryan until he was ultimately ejected from the project. Darryl F. Zanuck then turned the 14 words into this longer set piece scene, which, just as you have already observed, that is the beating heart of that movie. That's the most arresting and riveting scene in a movie where there's a lot of really riveting scenes. I'm a big fan of the Point to Hawk scene, which bears no likeness whatsoever to what actually happened there. Maybe we can talk about that another day, but the Point to Hawk scene in the movie is not even based on a true story. It's fantasy land from start to finish. And I feel like the Point to Hawk scene, as well as the Sainte-Mère-Église scene, provide us with a pretty powerful case for filmmakers will do what they do best. I had worked on a TV series for the History Channel 10 years ago called World War II in HD, and I came onto the project after a lot of decisions had already been made. And I remember coming on and dealing with the director who we clashed, and we ultimately kind of got along, but we clashed over issues of storytelling. And what he wanted to do was to tell story. I had been brought on the project to serve as an authenticity advisor and historical accuracy advisor, as an historian. And it began my long career of being paid to be a technical advisor on projects, being paid to write memos that people ignore. That's what I...
Yeah, if you get one victory in 10, you've done really well, yeah.
Yeah, see, you get it. You understand. Yeah. You worked
on... You learn to try and fight. You save your arguments for a big battle and concede 7 or 8, don't you? I've done that. You go, I'm not going to mention the fact that the obstacles are 6 inches too short. I'll leave that one. I will mention the fact they didn't have any T-34s in Sam. You save it for the big one. But yeah, if you win one, you've done well. Yeah, and again, just to interrupt you, the whole Longest Day film and book, they're merging other stories in. They want to get the Alexander Renault story in. They want to get because the German officer who attends mass, that's from another town. They borrow that from somewhere else. I mean, like we had Carol Schultz on the other day talking about Arthur Dutch Schultz. They borrow stories from Jack Schlegel. They borrow stories, and they all give it. So they're trying to take from all these sources, 505th, 507th, 508th, 4 or 5 French villages, and cram it all into Sainte-Mère-Église because that's their location. And that makes sense for a movie. Makes complete sense. So the John Steele account, 14 words, not very much to build on. And again, I know I'm speaking over you now, but the archives in Ohio for the Cornelius Ryan, they have all the notes of when they follow up things, don't they? They have all that there when they make phone calls. And I wonder why Ryan didn't follow that up, because hang on, he landed on church. That's worth. It's curious, and he's curious he didn't ask out wider at the time either, because he had the opportunity to ask people who were there as well about it.
He did. And, you know, I'm glad you mentioned that because that provides me an opportunity to talk about a 507th paratrooper named Willard Tex Young. Maybe you're familiar. In the book, The Longest Day, Tex Young is the only other voice that acknowledges a paratrooper suspended from the church. There's even still a big, ugly mess about what part of the church. Maybe we can get to that subject a little bit later on, but there are questions about roof of church, bell tower, roof of bell tower. All of that, I feel, is going to just drag us into an endless filibuster of personal accounts. And I could just get dragged into that for 30 minutes, or I could just say, everybody says something completely different, which is exactly the case. But Willard Tex Young is the only other personal account voice in the book, The Longest Day, that says that he saw somebody hanging from the church. He doesn't specify exactly where, but he says he sees somebody hanging from the church. The interesting detail there is that the Tex Young account, there's a quote in that that Cornelius Ryan uses in the book. And Tex Young, I have proof from the Ohio University archive where Tex Young had a telephone conversation with Cornelius Ryan. And then I know he did that because he wrote a letter to Cornelius Ryan after they had a telephone call. And in that letter, Tex Young is explaining and sort of straightening out some details. And he makes a critical statement where he says, I've done some further research. And in fact, if you don't mind me boring you to death with reading you one quick thing.
No, it's important.
I think it's important enough for the Tex Young stuff, because I'm going to find the account here in this mountain of other documentation. Because I pulled it out specifically just the other day so that I could bring it up. Hold on, I've got to find it. I'm running multiple control panels here because I've got the laptop with you on it, and I'm using the iPad to pull things up. All right, I found it. Here it is. And it's great. It's kind of great too, because Ohio University has these at high resolution. They don't have everything. Like, you can't get the John Steele questionnaire at high resolution. I reached out to them a little over a year ago, and they were like, oh no, we've sent this out to a contractor to have everything scanned. So we still have it. It's just at low resolution. So Tex Young writes this letter that's dated March 31st, 1959. He writes to Cornelius Ryan. He references a phone call from March 26th, 1959. And he goes on to explain a few things. And there's a critical detail that I wanted to mention in that, where Tex Young says in the letter, you almost had me convinced that I got into Sainte-Mère-Église earlier than 2:30 a.m. I'm pulling that specific thing out, particularly because I think it reveals something fascinating. And what it reveals is that these two men in this conversation were attempting to reconcile stories, which is precisely what you and I are trying to do 75 years later, 76 years later. And in it, by him using the specific wording, you almost had me convinced that I was there earlier than 2:30. That indicates that Ryan must have asked him, well, that can't be right. That had to be more like 1:30 a.m. or just after 2. It provides proof positive that the two men were attempting to create a timeline that worked. And I think it provides evidence that they were not capable of producing a timeline that worked, because the Tex Young quote from The Longest Day situates Tex Young in having seen it. And there are a couple of other things about the Tex Young story that just make you scratch your head. I'll read it to you if it's not too dreadful and boring for me to read.
The viewing numbers are going up all the time. This is my best viewed show for about 10 days, so it's fantastic.
Okay, good. Well, I'm just going to punch through this very quickly as soon as I get to it, because I've got The Longest Day up, and I'm getting down to it. I'm almost there now. This is where I'm paying a price for not having everything already in open browser windows. Here they're talking about Blanchard. There's Renault. I think I'm almost there. Okay, here we go. All right, and I even highlighted the point. Okay. Boom. This was in case if anyone's following along in their copy of The Longest Day, it's on page 135 of the widest produced version of the book. Ryan says, he hung so realistically dead in his harness that Lieutenant Willard Young of the 82nd Airborne, who passed by during the height of the fighting, still remembers the dead man hanging from the steeple. That's all he says. The interesting detail is that in Tex Young's questionnaire, he doesn't write those words, and he doesn't say anything about a man hanging from the steeple. Not a word. I'll send anybody who wants it the Tex Young questionnaire, but Tex Young says nothing about someone hanging from the church, be it, and everybody calls it steeple. It's a bell tower, but whatever. I don't want to be pedantic about it. There's not a single word about someone hanging from the church tower. I think that's important because then we now know they have a phone call. And in that phone call, I think Cornelius Ryan interrogated Tex Young about timings because, as you know, 507 doesn't start jumping until 2:38 a.m. 505, I think I was checking the timings this morning. I think 505 begins jumping at 1:51 a.m. So if this did happen, it's happening sometime closer to 2 than 3. Tex Young, if he lands on the outskirts of Sainte-Mère-Église, which is definitely entirely reasonable because we know what a scattered mess the 507 was.
Absolutely.
And we know that there are 507th troopers that are dropped on the east side of the N13 highway. And there are lots of them dropped on the east side of the N13 highway. So Tex Young, I don't doubt that about his account. But I think it's extremely important that he doesn't say a word about it in questionnaires, and that it's not until the telephone call that it comes up. The telephone call during which the two men are trying to thresh out the timing issue. And that's why I read the quote of Tex Young saying that you almost had me convinced that I was there before 2:30. Not that it makes a difference, because my bigger question is, if Tex Young was there and he was involved in a battle, and I should just read this one other quote from Tex Young that's dropped in here. Well, I can't get to it quickly enough for it to be useful. But Tex Young doesn't really provide any details in the questionnaire. He was obviously then questioned by Cornelius Ryan, during which somebody hanging from the church came up. I think it's critically important that by the time that the two men had the phone call of, what was it, March 26th, 1959, by the time that they had the phone call, Cornelius Ryan had already read the John Steele questionnaire. So Cornelius Ryan had already read a questionnaire that said hanging from the church, under the eaves of church steeple, Sainte-Mère-Église. And so clearly Ryan asked Tex Young about it. It looks like Tex Young said, yeah, I saw it. And that brings up the bigger question of, how did he see it? I know that sounds nasty. And I know there was a fire burning in town at the time, and the fire would have been lighting the entire scene in probably a pretty powerful way. But it feels a little strange for Tex Young to have seen it in the middle of the night. It led me to then question, well, when was the fire finally extinguished? And that's the point where I really feel like I'm going down a big rabbit hole. But that's not to say that Tex Young didn't see something. Maybe he saw something. It makes me then question, if he did see it, why didn't he mention it in the questionnaires? Granted, there's not a direct, specific question in the question
for that. Question 23, did you happen to see anybody hanging from churches? That wasn't a standard question in the Ryan questionnaire. But yeah, you'd think it would be something that would be memorable.
You would think it would be something that's memorable. But the Tex Young questionnaire and then the follow-up letter, I think, are critically important to working all of this out. Anyway, that's all we get out of Cornelius Ryan. So where we are now is we've gotten the 14 words that led us to Tex Young, that led us to a phone call between Tex Young and Cornelius Ryan, that led us to the 334 word written version that goes into the book, which then comes out in 59. And then after the book comes out, we get a movie. The scene in the movie is substantially longer and more colored and more dynamic and more interesting than the relatively short version of the event that's written in the book. And I think it's a critically important point to make that the movie version includes some things that absolutely, definitely did not happen. Like paratroopers armed with Thompson submachine guns spraying the church square with machine gun fire as they descended under an open parachute canopy. I am absolutely confident in saying that's definitely fictionalization of the event. That is definitely filmmakers trying to make the scene more dynamic.
Yeah. I think we can also say, that there are other things in the Longest Day book that are categorically incorrect as well. The French commando attack on the casino in Sword Beach is all over the place, for example. So it's when we're examining this history, if, for example, the Longest Day book, 99% of all the stories in it were absolutely straight up and true and documented and provable, and the only one that wasn't was John Steele, that would be an anomaly. But the fact is, and this is no criticism of Cornelius Ryan, it's a great book, it's a great read, but there's quite a lot of things in it that are very dubious because they're based on single accounts by single people and it got kind of embellished. And let's say the French casino being a casino building with nuns, which was no basis on reality. It was a low series of fortifications and trenches and bunkers and barbed wire. So the book can be questioned generally, and I think that's important to look at how we perceive that whole thing. And the movie has lots of things in it are wrong. So neither of those sources are built on a bed of solid foundations. Is that a fair way of saying it, I think?
Absolutely.
And yet they're both great. I mean, I'm saying that liking them both. So, I mean, I know we're going to go back to the personal accounts. I think I'm watching what's going on YouTube. People are asking about photos and the evidence. Let's before we go down all the other people like Ken Russell and John Ray and things like, let's talk about the actual physicality of the church. Let's run with the idea for the time being, I think, that there is at least one person hanging from the church that morning. And if they are hanging from the church, they had to have got down from that church. So let's go through some physical evidence first. The only way to get down from a church is to go down and out, or up and in and out, isn't it? That's the two ways down, isn't it? So we have both had sort of hate mail things coming about this show, and I had someone saying that the French could have helped someone down with a 50-foot ladder to get them down from the church, and you go, how many French people in that square, A, had a 50-foot ladder? How many would be running out in a town that's on fire, under fire, Germans and Americans having running battles in the streets with a ladder to get someone down the church tower? It makes no sense.
And Paul, why would none of the French persons
mention it?
And eyewitnesses mention someone hanging from the church.
Well, let's do that then. Let's talk about the French accounts, because we're talking about, we've done Cornelius Ryan. Let's talk about the fact that Sainte-Mère-Église very early on built herself a bit of a reputation with the Renault family and Simone Renault looking after the graves there. Life magazine covered it, 46, 47, 48. Sainte-Mère-Église was probably already one of the most famous towns outside of France by the late 40s, wasn't it? Would we agree on that?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And the Mayor Alexandre Renaud, his book is one of the first books of any nationality about the invasion. We would agree on that as well, wouldn't we? And he knows the people in town. He's the mayor, for Christ's sake, so he has access to everybody. It's a small, close-knit community. They're all living around the square, and they start writing stuff down very early. And the point is, Marty, how many of them mention anybody hanging from the church? Well, you just said it yourself. It's none, isn't it? Zero.
In fact, I'll read an Alexandre Renaud quote to you from the book. Not that you haven't read it before. I know you've read it, but this is for the good of the order.
Yeah.
Renaud says, "We tore the remaining parachutes from the trees, and our dear ones, left for their last journey, were wrapped in these great sails of pure silk." So he's talking about men in the church, in the town square, in the center of Sainte-Mère-Église, who were dead after the jump. And he's mentioning their parachutes. And so within that context, it feels like if he had seen someone hanging from the church, he would have mentioned it, at least a word, but not a breath of a word about that. I think that's an important point that's worth making here. That brings up the possibility then that if you imagine that when the airplanes came overhead and dropped a few paratroopers in the area, and then other airplanes dropped paratroopers in the area around town, that would have caused the French to seek shelter and cover in their homes. And so they would have been indoors at this critical moment. And especially if there was gunplay around the center of Sainte-Mère-Église, they would have retreated indoors. That's what I would have done. And so if somebody was on the church tower and then was somehow taken down, maybe that happened before the French people came out, and that's why Renaud didn't see it. Maybe that's it. But you have already brought up what I think is perhaps the most important point to be made here today. And that is, how did he get down? Because John Steele does not say a word about how he got down. In fact, as I know you know, but maybe not everybody else realizes, is that Steele died relatively young. Steele died on May 12th, 1969. And July 12th, 1969. He dies in 69. And so he was around for a few years after the movie. He became a bit of a household name. He became a bit of a well-known person in Sainte-Mère-Église itself. And during that time, I have yet to find where he provided any sort of detailed account or explanation about what happened. There are a few newspaper articles that talk about John Steele, and they claim to have interviewed John Steele. But what I find interesting about that is that it doesn't provide what I traditionally expect out of a personal account. That is, and John Steele said, quote, words, end quote. Yeah. It was newspaper reporters that did like I had to learn how to do when I was in graduate school. And that is, we had to create abstractions of ideas. There's John himself in the center of Sainte-Mère-Église. This used to be sold as a postcard in Sainte-Mère-Église back in the day, a long time ago. I think they're selling them again as sort of a retro thing. At any rate, the newspaper articles that I have found that were generated after the movie came out, they are reporters who generated abstractions from conversations that they had with John Steele. It was so much harder back then to be someone that reported on an interview, and a spontaneous on-the-spot interview with somebody, because people didn't just walk around with little recording devices in their pocket.
Yeah, exactly.
It was reporters with a notebook, and you took notes. And so there's not a direct quote. There's not a transcription of a long direct quote from John Steele saying where he was, what happened, and how he got down. There's absolutely nothing telling us how he got down. We don't get that until we get to Rudolph May and Rudy Escher. And I say their names with a little bit of a roll of the eyes because the two Germans ultimately emerge and do nothing but throw a blanket of confusion over the top of all of this.
Yeah.
And just this morning, in sort of digging into things a little bit more, I discovered an account that strangely blends Rudy Escher and Rudolph May into one person, into one long narrative. And I'm not convinced that the author understood that they were two people, because Rudy and Rudolph, that might make you think that you're dealing with the same person. I don't know. It could have been a mistake made, or it could have just been a confused historian. There are a lot of those out there. But regardless, there are multiple sources for the personal accounts of Rudolph May and Rudy Escher. Rudolph May was a person on his personal account establishes him as being on one of the two balconies at the top of the bell tower. It's never entirely clear whether it's the northern balcony or the southern balcony, but he's on one of the two balconies, supposedly with machine gun, spraying machine gun fire down onto the town square, which is something I find a little doubtful too, but that's all right, because there are friendly troops down there.
Yeah.
At any rate.
And just angles as well.
It's not exactly a great angle. And besides, the impression that I get is that whole matter of cleaning up the one stick of F Company 505 paratroopers that land in the middle of town, that was sorted out pretty quickly.
Yeah, 5 minutes. Yeah, yeah.
A handful of minutes. There were a few others from other units that landed in the area around Sainte-Mère-Église too, but I don't imagine that this being a raging gun battle that goes on for an hour. No. At any rate, Rudolph May is on either the northern or southern balcony of the bell tower. And there's a tiny, tiny little balcony up there on both sides. Rudy Escher is the one who was racing his bicycle around the church while the guys were killing time before 10 a.m. And he was, I think, a Gefreiter. He was an NCO. His story is, I think, a very interesting one in that as soon as everything hits the fan, he is around the center of town first. There's a little bit of a commander's conference where the men are gathered up and talking about what they're going to do. And then they dash off to, what is it, Chateau de Fauville, which is about a mile south of town.
Mile out, yep.
Yeah, about a mile south of town, which is, I guess, where that detachment was headquartered. And they're all 1058th Infantry, 91st Luftland.
Yep.
Well, Escher, his personal account, which is well covered in several books, to include George Bernage writing in Himdall publications, to include a couple of other books that I'm not going to just provide an endless bibliography. I can send all of that to you later on. But Escher's account is he's there. He's not in the bell tower. He mentions seeing somebody. Then he mentions they take bicycles and they go off south to Chateau de Fauville. Rudolph May, however, is on the bell tower, and he provides a very specific personal account that there's no other way to put it than I find it to be very, very puzzling. And the account was that they're up there spraying, he's up there with another German soldier, and they're spraying machine gun fire down onto the church square, and he sees a shadow, and it's John Steele's parachute canopy passing over, and then the parachute snags on that balcony. Never clear whether it's northern balcony or southern balcony, and that actually is an important point. Never clear, though. And he goes on to explain how they wanted to try and shoot the American. The other soldier wanted to shoot the American. Rudolph May apparently stopped him and said, "Are you stupid? Don't do that. Then they'll know we're up here," which is, I think, a little bit of a confusing account. And then, and here's the important point, Rudolph May then says he used a pocket knife to cut the suspension lines to let the American paratrooper down. So let's just say, for the sake of the discussion, that John Steele's parachute snags on that northern, or no, it doesn't matter, northern or southern, but it snags on one of the two balconies. And that John Steele then dangling from suspension lines that are what, 30 feet long at the longest?
Yeah.
That puts John Steele then still dangling. I think if it happened like that, he would be dangling a little bit lower than the mannequin is today, but roughly at the height that the mannequin is, a little bit lower maybe. And if they cut him down and let him go, I think it's safe to assume he would have fallen to his death, because that's a long way to fall. That's over 70 feet.
Especially with gear on. I mean, especially, yeah, with the weight of gear he's got on it. And he's, you know, we've been through it. He's not 19, he's 32 or something. He's more likely to break a bow. You know, we know from the accounts of the 17, 18-year-old paratroopers how better they dealt with the shock of landings. They look at Van der Voort, look at Van Mosley. They're the ones breaking ankles and popping knees because they're older. So yeah, I mean, I know he did have the injury to it, and he was shot. He said he was shot. I just want to go backpedal a bit and talk about the fact that when John Steele was visiting Normandy many times, he didn't go back and either agree with the longer stay version of the film account or either disagree with it. Now, let's take something like Band of Brothers, just to connect it up. The veterans who were portrayed in that never missed an opportunity to point out things that were different about the TV show. Of course, I wasn't actually there that day. Of course, it was Sergeant Toy that day, not Sergeant Sunser. There's no sheer mathematical probability the sequel to The Longest Day cannot be completely correct, because we know there were screenwriters involved, there's stunt people in there. Even if he was there, it can't have been absolutely right. So you have to wonder why at no point he said, by the way, though, it was over there. By the way, there was no attempt to kind of either agree with it or double check or clarify anything. He just went with it. He pointed up at the church and posed for his photos, and that was it. So that's interesting, I think, as well. But so if he doesn't go down, if Rudy is cutting the lines, he doesn't go down. The other option is going up and in, isn't it? That's the other. And I've read that in accounts that he was pulled up into the church and down. Now, I appreciate that most people watching this will have not had access to the church tower at Sainte-Mère-Église. I have one a few years ago, and to be honest, I wasn't particularly thinking about John Steele that day. I was thinking about other things. But basically, it's very narrow, very difficult to get up there. You've got to kind of be a gymnast to go up there. You've got to go through hatches and things and ropes and things, and if there's one or two Germans up there on one or other of the balconies, and they're bringing up a third person there, for them to get down a wounded guy, I'm going to say, and I'm sure you're going to agree with it, it's just not possible. There's no way you could get a guy down through that hatch without him making his own journey down. Is that right?
It is scientifically and empirically impossible.
Yeah.
for you to bring somebody, especially a wounded paratrooper, someone wounded in the foot too, down from the bell tower. And just to spell it out for everybody, I can send out a video. You've seen the video that was recorded by our friend Guillaume Marie. And in the video, it is him going all the way up to, he goes out on both the northern ledge and the southern ledge, but going up. And that the way it happens is that you actually enter from within the narthex, not at all the way at the end of the church where the high altar is, but in the narthex. There's a secondary altar, like a baptismal altar, that has a hidden door in it that I couldn't fit my fat ass through. And you would have to squeeze through that. You go down a passageway, then you reach the spiral staircase that takes you up to the better part of the tower. Then you go out onto the platform of the lower level where Rudolph May and Rudy Escher said that they were quartered. And from there, you climb up a wooden ladder that even in the 21st century looks like it's about to fall apart. And you climb up a distance of about 25 feet to get to the bell platform. And from the bell platform, then you have to go up again and go out on either one of these little ledges that require you to kind of duck down. And without being too melodramatic about it, I find it to be laughable that's ever even been considered as a possibility, because it's clearly not a possibility. So what do we have? We have the possibility of him being pulled all the way up to the ledge, either the northern or the southern ledge, and then taken down. I don't think that could have worked, especially a wounded man. And then the other possibility of Rudolph May using his pocket knife to cut him down and letting him fall. I don't think that's likely, because if that happened, how did John Steele not shatter every bone in his legs? And why did John Steele never say a word about it?
Yeah.
So
well, I mean, this goes back to the initial thing about John's 14 words. However he got down from that church tower, it was a saga. It was going to involve something you would describe. You know, he's mentioned in the interview he was up there, but then no explanation. And my God, let me tell you about how the hell I got down, because that is a story in itself, Mr. Ryan, because that's what it's going to be. It's going to have to involve drama in some shape or form, either a risky, perilous jump on the outside or a risky, perilous journey where he's climbing down a however many 25-foot 30 rung ladder with a busted ankle and all that gear down, and thinking, is this going to break? Am I going to go? What's going to happen to me? And yet there's no mention of it. So again, we could just spend ages talking about John Steele. Let's look at some of the other American accounts, because people have been asking, when are we going to mention Ken Russell? Because Ken Russell is also a feature of this story. So he was another paratrooper who also landed in Sainte-Mère-Église, and he contributed versions to the story as well. So, and I met Ken Russell once many years ago, and I got the impression, I'll just say this little forward there, that he was doing a tour. He was there to tell stories, and he was part of the team. He was there in a sense as a showman. He was there to tell people what they wanted to hear. That, and we've all been part of that tour. So I don't think he was on a particularly quest to find out what happened. He was just going along as a guest and doing what he was supposed to do to be part of the team. But let Marty explain what he says.
Ken Russell comes along and says that he was hanging from the church too. He's very specific about he was not hanging from the bell tower, but that he was hanging from some lower height, that he was hanging below John Steele. He mentions John Steele and references him, but that's where the coherence of that story comes to a crushing end, because from that point beyond, he actually tells two versions.
Yeah.
He is introduced to the world by two historians, the late Stephen Ambrose and an historian named Rontrez. And they both use personal accounts where Russell describes how he was hanging from the church tower. He was hanging from the church, and that he was hanging from a lower height, and that he cut his suspension lines and let himself down, and then ran off into the night, having experiences beyond that I find to be implausible, like encountering a flak gun on a half track on the outskirts of Sainte-Mère-Église, one that nobody mentions and there's no evidence of. At any rate, that's not what we're here to talk about. The Russell account, I think, is important because when it emerges in Ambrose and Dres, that's the point at which we move the venue. We have this change of venue from all of the action taking place on the southwest corner of the tower to moving it to the northwest corner of the tower. And that's a significant part of this story because there are physical impossibilities that make it such that you can't even reconcile Ken Russell's own personal accounts with these versions. I should also mention that Hemdahl Publications also come in strong on the North Side narrative. And the North Side narrative is kind of complicated by photographic evidence that we have. And somebody asked about that earlier. It's really easy to sort this out because we have a handful of photos. The photos don't help us. We have one aerial reconnaissance photograph that's taken on June 6th. We don't know exactly what time. And it passes over Sainte-Mère-Église. We've got it at high resolution. I think I've sent it to you. I mean, you may have already had it to begin with. You may have given it to me for all I know.
I can't remember.
But it's the important detail is that there is absolutely no evidence whatsoever of any parachutes anywhere around the center of Sainte-Mère-Église. Now, I know how everybody will argue that, and that will be that by the time that reconnaissance photograph was taken, aircraft had, dawn had already risen and the scene had been kind of cleaned up. And my thought was that, well, if there was somebody suspended from the bell tower, would you be in a big hot hurry to get up there and clean up his parachute canopy that was snagged on the height all the way up to that highest level? It doesn't matter. And I say that that photo is not helpful because what I wish is that there was a photo that showed evidence of something dangling from the church tower, and we don't see that. In addition to that, the area around the church square where I expected to see potentially parachute canopies, maybe T5 canopies, nylon canopies, maybe even some silk canopies from equipment bundles. There's nothing. There's absolutely nothing. It's probable that by then everything had been cleaned up. However, I would point out that I think it was the same recon mission. They took a photo at the same time, possibly even on the same mission on June 6th. That's the area around the Chateau Berneville that shows the Fallais death site. And I know you know that photo.
Yeah.
Because you can see Fallais' sedan crashed into the side of that mill. And just south of Fallais' sedan on the other side of the hedgerows in the open field, there are parachutes laying everywhere. And I'm seeing specifically white silk parachute canopies associated with equipment bundles. Can I pause for a minute? The dogs are demanding to be let back in.
Okay. I will keep on talking. So, and we may or may not share that photo, the aerial photo. The interesting thing, when me and Marty talked about this, and I know there's lots of tour guides watching this, Ronald and Niels and Sean and Stuart were watching this. The photo doesn't show parachutes, but it doesn't not show parachutes. There could be parachutes that are in the photo that you can't see. If, for example, there's a white parachute and it is in a whiter part of the photo, just because we can't see a parachute doesn't mean there aren't there, but there are no obvious parachutes. That's, I think, what we're going to be clarified about that. And as you're saying, what would be nice to have absolutely definitively seen a parachute in the photo and go, oh, look, there it is. It's that you can't disprove a negative, is it? That's what we're going to be going. The case what we were talking about in this show is there good evidence for John Steele being on the church? And I'm telling you, spoiler alert, folks, we're not going to confirm he wasn't on the church. If you think we're going to be able to categorically say that John Steele was not on the church, we are not going to go that far. We can't. What we can say is, and we're skipping ahead a bit, is the claim is, did someone land on the church? And our response is there's not enough good evidence to support that claim. I think that's where we're at right now, isn't it?
It is.
But we can't definitively say wasn't.
Yeah. Well, there's one thing that I love about that, the reconnaissance photo of Chateau Berneville, because do you remember what it was like before everybody had that photo? There were, good luck. I'm sorry, Frankie keeps drinking water and it sounds like an elephant drinking water. Frankie, would you please stop?
It's all good.
Excuse me for that. But the Fallais photograph, when it emerged, it confirmed that story. We had Malcolm Brandon and Jack Schlegel that were telling that story for years and years. And I even remember people back in the 1990s kind of rolling their eyes and doubting the Brandon and the Schlegel stories a little bit. And then the photo came out and bam, you can't argue with it. There's a car
the
crashed.
direction was correct. The corner of the car matched to where the known damage is on the side of the building. Everything just go, yeah, perfect. Case closed. Move on. That's it. You know, we can argue about the timing. We could argue about how many shots were fired. We can still argue about which German was in the front and which was in the car. But we cannot in any way dispute that a car was on that road and hit that wall and was shot up. That is categorically provable. Empirical evidence, as you say. But the John Steele thing, we go back there, is and I'm telling you, people on YouTube, they're already here. They're all asking about John Ray. They're asking about this, that, and the other. And you know, so Stuart is saying, did John Steele go to Normandy before the Ryan account, or was it only after the Ryan account? To my best of my knowledge, it's after. It's all afterwards, isn't it? And after the movie as well.
I'm glad he asked that question, because I dug into that, because I thought that would have been centrally important about him creating a narrative and going with the narrative. And I thought maybe the French were kind of promoting him into that narrative. And it appears that that is not the case. It appears that he doesn't visit Normandy. And in fact, I can send you the letters. I got these from Ohio University last year, where when he wrote Cornelius Ryan when the book came out, asking for the autographed copy. That's the letter that made me think they never talked on the phone. He then wrote Cornelius Ryan before the movie was to premiere. He wrote to James Gavin and Cornelius Ryan, asking them to help arrange for him to be present for the premiere of the movie. And Gavin even then forwarded on the letter to the U.S. ambassador, Frankie, stop drinking water, please. Sorry. Anyway, Cornelius Ryan received a letter from him asking to go before the movie. From what I could find from Ohio University, he didn't even attend the premiere. And so to me, the famous photograph of him standing in his black suit in front of the church, I think that photograph is taken during his first visit. And I think his first visit wasn't until 1963. That would be June 6, 1963.
I've got that. I've got those photos somewhere. They were in, I'm going to say Paris match, but it might not have been. They were in a feature about a year or two after Longest Day film came out, and it was in a French magazine, and that's where, as far as I recall, those photos of John Steele there, and there's the one of him coming over, he's being kissed by the two flight attendants. That, as far as I understand, because the magazine that was in was either 63 or I'm going to say 64, but it was definitely after the movie. We ought to, it's come up in, we're going off down the rabbit hole, it's come up from, thanks to Stuart again. People may or may not be aware, there's a story, a rumor, a suggestion that there was a 505th or 82nd Airborne reunion at some point where there was a discussion about someone landing on the church tower, and at that occasion someone said, wasn't that you, John, wasn't that you, Pop, or something, and that's when he put his hand up. Do we know where, if this happened, when that was?
I've heard
that all just a story?
I don't know. I've heard about it. Well, it looks like Frankie wants to join us. Hello, say hi.
Hello, Frankie.
All right, will you please let me do my business? Thank you. I've heard about it. Ellen Peters told me about this, in fact, at one point, and I have never found any documentation aside from hearsay evidence from people that were there, and I don't want to discount it, and at the same time, I don't want to listen to it. I don't want to pay it any credence, and it's just something that's rumored that didn't get documented, and I've been bitten too many times by that kind of stuff. And so that's why I wish that we could come up with a photo like the Bernaville photo with Fale Staff Car. I wish we could just come up with a smoking. What I wish is that we would come up with something that confirmed that Steele was up there, because then I could put this to bed.
Leave it. Yeah, move on. Yes, so there he is. There's the photo. There's some French person coming out with a brownie camera and saying, there's the photo. I took that at 2:00 that morning. There's the photo. Yeah, put it to bed. I mean, because, again, Stuart's watching this. Sean's watching this. There are other guides, I'm sure, watching. Dennis van den Brink is watching this. We've all been guilty of, and I'm putting my hand up here, we've been guilty of trying to make our stories fit the Assembly 1 version. And we've also all tried to make it not fit that, to try and kind of be cool and tell our questions, well, actually, I don't think it happened. And I've gone back and forth. Last year, obviously, weren't touring at all. I was just trying to get it done as quickly as possible and move on to somewhere else. In my case, it was Neuville-au-Plan I would go to and talk about that and say, okay, there's a parachute. Yeah, take your photos, windows, go and talk about something else. But, we've all heard. we've all heard stories. We've all heard these things. Oh, yeah, the reunion, this, and again, we can't necessarily discount them, but there's nothing there to necessarily say they're true. So until such time as someone comes out with minutes of a meeting or something like that, then that's going to remains kind of stuck. John Ray, let's bring in John Ray. And for those who are watching, John Ray is a sergeant in the same F Company 505th who is wounded in the square and sometime later dies, although we all now know it was definitely an earlier date. And there's another potential massive great rabbit hole down here we can go to with John Ray that involves gravestones being changed back at the ABMC, and a whole saga of a wife and this and a family, and the point is, he was a very brave man from New Orleans who died in Normandy as part of the invasion. 6'2" football player from New Orleans, but his widow comes into the story because of her visits to Normandy, and she unfortunately ended up adding mud to the she just added another whole level of complexity. So let's talk about the John Ray account and what we can categorically say about him and what we can categorically say not about him.
Yeah, John Ray was not something, he's not brought up in The Longest Day of the book. He's not brought up in the movie. His name really isn't introduced to this story until Ken Russell comes forward, and Ken Russell's personal accounts are used by Rondres, Stephen Ambrose, George Bernage, and others. And he figures into it from the Russell perspective, because Russell then tells the eyewitness story of having seen John Ray shot and killed. Well, Ken Russell's story is that he's hanging from the roof, and just for the record, the Rondres accounts and George Bernage, Heimdall accounts situate him on the north side of the roof of the narthex. Ken Russell himself said it, and I looked it up this morning. He said specifically that when you look at the church, I was on the roof to the right, which to me means I'm still confused. Like, are you standing in front of, looking straight at the front entrance? Yeah. Or are you standing over by the calvaire and saying to the right? We don't know, and Ken Russell's no longer around to answer questions. Yeah. So I think that means that the story that he told is not one that's situated on the north side of the church. The story he himself told is situated to the south side of the church, which then means that we have a generation of historians that shift the story over to the north side. And I think they do so without a lot of good reason to do so, without any good evidence.
Well, that's the question. I mean, Jake Powers, who used to work for Stephen Ambrose, and he worked on his own, and I don't have anything to do with Jake these days, but he was there with Ken Russell once, and maybe Chris Anderson was there, I don't know, maybe Rondres was there, and at some point, and this is a version I used on my tours, they started moving Ken Russell, or he started moving himself to, I'm going to say, the north west side, so that when he runs off south through the square, he goes past the Roman marker, and I started moving it to there based on that, but didn't really know quite why I moved it. I remember numerous times I've been standing on the north west side, and Dale has been standing on the northeast side. We're both doing our stories, going, the other guy over there, he may actually have it right, I don't know, and neither of us were strong enough of our conviction to say, I'm definitely right. It was just also, and this is another point, convenient as tour guides to stand in different locations, because it gets very busy there in May and June and July. And right. if there's 10 guides standing, if we're all standing in a slightly different place, it makes just sheer practical sense. And that, I think, we have to acknowledge the fact that we as tour guides are as guilty as anybody else, if not more guilty as anybody else, as muddying the water, because I've trained guides I've trained have trained other guides. You've trained people. Chad is watching this, who's learned from me and you and Chris Anderson over the years. We're all passing on possibly duff information that we got from someone else's duff. And there's simply that angle, as I said, of managing a tour group in Sainte-Mère-Église, and standing in different places is part of that simple practicality of getting your tour group through there. And so big groups tend to go on the south of the square, in the main part of the square, because it's easy to stand a big group there, and a small group, it's easy to go on the north side. So that means that simply the practicality of handling the size of a tour group has an impact.
Yeah, well, I settled into this routine of telling the Northwest corner version of the story, which is kind of the George Bernard, Ron Dres, Stephen Ambrose version of the story, because I found that if I just made a beeline straight there, there wouldn't be any other groups there. And I would have room to get 20 or 30 people gathered around, and I'd tell them that story. But the second that you start to tell the John Ray, Ken Russell story, everything falls apart.
Yeah.
Because then people will go, well, why is the mannequin on the south side? And then I'll go, well, that's because that's where he was in the movie. And they're like, so then where was he actually? And I'll go, well, some people say that he was here on the northwest corner, way up there. And then you add to that the photo evidence that complicates that, because I call it the I call it the 150 photo. There's a photograph that's taken at 1:50 p.m. in the afternoon on June 6th. And everybody knows the photo. It's taken sort of oriented in the street, sort of towards Stop Bar, and looking up, and it's 1:10, or it's 10 till 1 p.m. It's either 10 till 1 or 10 till 2. I think it's 10 till 1. Please tell me you're going to pull up that photo. There it is. There's the photo. That's this. There's another photo taken shortly before that. But in that, you see this building on the far right side. That building, I think, complicates the story of the northwest corner. There was a gap. That building's long gone.
Yeah. And
there was a gap. Hold on. I got to let Frankie out again. Hold on. Come on, Frank. Sorry. But that building was torn down at some point after the war. I'm not entirely sure when it came down.
That's the different phase two. That's the one. There's two. I had the different one. Yeah, okay.
What is it? It looks like it's 10 till... It looks
10
like 10
till
1. Yeah, 10 till 1.
Yeah.
But that building's not there anymore. I think that building interferes to a certain extent with Northwest Corner narrative. And then a big point I like to make is that there's no evidence of any kind of parachute risers or parachute canopy or anything up there.
No.
Not that that is a likelihood, because let's face it, it is historians who produced secondary sources that resituated, changed the venue to the northwest corner, because that's not what Ken Russell says. Ken Russell's exact quote, I can read it to you if you want me to dig it up and bore you with it, but he says, if you stand facing the church, I landed on the church roof to the right. He doesn't explain if he was standing in front of the door or standing over near the Calvaire, but he says to the right, and I think that leads out that corner. But then you get people that go with the northwest corner narrative, which I think is definitely not true. You've got the photo evidence. Yeah, you've got photo evidence and the recon photo that shows no evidence of anything. You've got the photos you just put up that show no evidence of anything. I'm not saying that what is it, the old saying, the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence, or wait, is it the other way? The evidence of absence is not it is the absence of evidence doesn't mean the evidence of absence. And there's always the possibility that everything just got kind of cleaned up immediately before dawn, and that's why we're not seeing any evidence. And I understand all of that, and I acknowledge all of that, but gosh, I sure wish there was something. I wish there was something, because in the times that I have mentioned my doubts about some of the narratives that have emerged about this story, people immediately cast me as a person that has no respect for veterans. And I like, for the 75th anniversary, somebody posted some melodramatic statement about John Steele and the church tower, and I got foolishly drawn into a filibuster of that on Facebook, which is the dumbest thing I could have ever done. And by the time it was over with, I was being accused of being somebody that was trying to take our heroes away. And my argument to that is, no, I'm not. I'm just saying that this story, I think, is, even if it did happen, it's really not that big a deal. Just because a movie thought that it was a big deal doesn't mean that it's worth being remembered for 75 years. Yeah. And let's go talk about John Ashley. That's all. That story fascinates me, and I'd rather talk about that, because maybe you have felt my pain on this. I have in tours. It wasn't like this 10 years ago. It's been like this only during the last 5 years, not counting the calendar year 2020. But there were times where I had to turn to the tour group and go and clap at them. All right, we're not talking about movies anymore. I am only going to, from this point forward, talk about people that lived and people that actually fought here, because I got just fed up to hear with talking about John Miller and talking about Private Ryan and talking about The Longest Day. I just kind of got to a point and talking about endlessly about Band of Brothers.
So
Not
there's
they're bad projects.
there's a couple of questions coming. So Stuart Robertson is saying two questions from Stuart. One is that photo taken at 10-1. Is that a staged photo? And I think I'm with Stuart. I think that is I think faked is too strong. Staged in a sense, there was still things going on in Sainte-Mère-Église. Sainte-Mère-Église was starting to. I think it's kind of while things are happening, it was kind of put together. But I'm not saying it's not staged in the sense of a completely fabricated journalist coming in. There's nothing going on. Grabbing two guys, right? Go and stand there. It was kind of reshot, possibly. I think would be my interpretation rather than staged. It's all about language, isn't it?
It really is. And it is clearly that. It is clearly a photo where a photographer, he framed his shot, he got some men, maybe he even asked them to go in there and kind of look like you're fighting. And that's definitely the case. And that is completely irrelevant. Yeah. Because the reason that I brought the photo up to begin with is as a part of this broader point that I'm making where I'm saying, oh God, I wish there was a photo that gave us some proof that we could hang this story on, but there's not so far. I wish for the day where somebody finds a photo album, or like you said, some brownie camera photos taken after sunrise on Tuesday, June 6th, where we can see evidence. The fact that a photographer was in there, maybe potentially directing people, I see where he's going. It's like, the famous photos of the Puteaux ambush from the Battle of the Bulge, where I think it's some troops from Kampfgruppe Knedel and some Luftwaffe field division guys, where they had ambushed the column, this cavalry reconnaissance squadron. The vehicles were all destroyed, and then everybody moved on. And a photographer showed up and then called some troops over to make it look like they were fighting. Staged in that way. And this photo to me, and without even stepping into the broader topic of the way that photographers documented this, because there's an appalling lack of photographic evidence from the 82nd, especially from the 507th, in that the photographers, as a part of the 82nd Airborne Division misdrops, really didn't turn in a lot of work. And so we don't have much. And I to this day have not been able to track down specifics about the exact date of that photo. I think it's June 6th.
Well, interesting. I was talking to Mitch Yockelson on the show a couple of nights ago, and he was saying about those journalists embedded, Wright, Bryant, and the other with the Airborne, but they were there to do audio and write stuff down. There was a distinct lack of photographers for whatever reason with the Airborne, but a really good record of I mean, we have Richard Dimbleby in the British sector and the glider and stuff like that. We've got great audio, but there's not much in the way of photos. But another question from Stuart as well, and I think it's relevant anyway, is who have we spoken to ourselves and others in terms of the Renault family? Because Henri Renault is in town. There's other people there who've been involved in the museum. Have they confirmed or not confirmed anything? And I haven't spoken to Henri Renault at length. I did go and visit him. I think might have been with Sean a few years ago. And my recollection of that encounter was very happy to talk about Sainte-Mère-Église, very happy to talk about his mother, very happy to talk about Remembrance, the museum, all that. But kind of when the church and the John Steele came up, I kind of remember an eye rolling and a kind of, oh, here we go again. And I feel he tried to move the conversation on rather quickly. That's my recollection of that. I didn't take any minutes. I didn't record it. I didn't have any camera or audio advice with me. Have you spoken to the Renault family, Marty?
I have, and I was invited to go to the Renault house, that house that's there south of town. Yeah. In July 2006, I went there with a filmmaker named Steve Droder, and we were welcomed, and there were cocktails, and it was just us, and we had a nice chat about it, and I brought the subject up and got the same result that you did. I got sort of a disinterested retelling of the movie version, and then we moved on. And out of deference to him, I didn't want to do anything that could be potentially perceived as being rude, because the French people are so nice to me whenever I'm over there. And I just kind of let the story go. I did have one interesting incident at one point. I got involved in making the film that is now at Cinéma Circulaire at Airborne. I got involved. It's called Saint-Gilles. I got involved in making that, and I was not the historical advisor, but one of several historical advisors. And there was an historical advisor who was an older historian from Caen, and I think he taught at the university, and he was a super smart guy. I can't remember his name right now. And at one point when we were working on that movie, I asked him about it. And his exact quote to me was like, well, you know, it's bullshit, right?
Was it Jean Kelliat or was it the other guy, Jean?
Jean Kelliat, that's it.
John Kelliat, yeah, because Mag was talking about him earlier, because Mag said we should have invited, because he's fascinated by this story, and he has been saying for years, yeah, it's just, and that's the thing. I mean, Stuart underlined what we said earlier, is that why should we, for questioning these events, be kind of accused of being unpatriotic or unsupporting of veterans, or that somehow we're shitting on the memory of men who fought there? I don't think there's anything we've said in this conversation is any way disrespectful to anybody, John Steele, Ken Russell, anybody, because it isn't actually them that has enlarged the story. It is us and the whole industry, and the fact that the models in the church with them, it's everybody. We've all been part of it, and I've been just as guilty as anybody else of going with different ways with this and just trying to make it fit a story. And if one thing about the COVID year 2020 has taught me is that when I do get back into guiding again, hopefully, please, I will readdress and reevaluate how I've been looking at things, because I have broadened out my interest this last year with what I'm doing on this channel. Yeah, I'm reading about things that I didn't read about before. I'm reading about the Ukraine, Prit Buttar's amazing book, Retribution, about the destruction of the German army in Ukraine. And I'm going, bloody hell, this is far more fascinating than deciding whether or not the bloody guns at Point du Hoc were in this hedgerow or that hedgerow. You know what I mean? And I will go back with this saying, actually, you know what? I'm going to talk about what I think is important. And if I think what is important is Neuville-les-Plains or Fauville or Lafayette, that's the hell where I'm going to go now. Kind of a damn with my customers. I don't mean that, but you know, I don't want to go and spend out. This is my kind of Alcoholics Anonymous. This is my my last time I'm going to spend this amount of time talking about the John Steele story, and after that I'm putting it to bed and we deal with it. So John Ray's widow, I think we went off down a side path because she came back and she was here with Ken Russell at some point, wasn't it? And that, I think we have to add this whole element of the fact she is visiting where her late husband was killed, and there's a whole emotional level to it there, and someone is there with a camera and they're trying to get things set up, and she points to a place, or Ken Russell points to a place, and that, as far as I'm concerned, just again muddies the water completely. It doesn't provide any kind of resolution or verification of anything. It just adds another layer of complexity. But anything you want to add about that side of it and the change of accounts at that point?
Yes, there is. And you'll probably have to stop me because I have a lot I want to add. Paula Guidry ultimately publishes this book that's called Treasures from My Heart, I guess is what it's called.
Yep.
And in that book, interestingly, toward the end of it, the whole shtick of the book, the whole heart of the book is she is publishing letters that he wrote her and she wrote him. Because she got the letters that she had written to him, she got them back when his personal effects were returned after his death in Normandy. And in publishing those letters, it's fascinating. The book has a charm because it gives you this insight into this young couple, and how the D-Day invasion tore them apart. But then she inadvertently and unintentionally muddies the water, because in the letters in the book, she publishes a couple after that I just wanted to read to you very quickly.
Yeah, please.
I'll move through them quickly.
And while you're finding it, it's a great book, by the way, folks, because it's one of those ones. It's in my. I've got one by Sandra Badilla Thompson about her father in the 502nd. It's all the letters home, and you read it and you cry your way through it. But they kind of go on my I'm not using that for history shelf. That's my. Yeah. Why am I doing this as a job shelf? Reminding you of young people being killed in combat. When you want a kind of boost of that, I read those books, but I don't turn to them for the detail. But anyway, if you're ready to read the account, let's go.
This book gives you nothing but heart and soul, and that's why it's a really good book. And listen to this. This is a letter she writes on August 22nd. By this point, she has heard they were writing each other every day. The letter stopped on June 5th. On August 22nd, she writes, "Dearest darling, just a few minutes ago, your dad called and read a telegram to me from Paul Maloney, a congressman in Washington. The telegram said that you were slightly wounded, and it gives an address by which we could write you." She goes on to say, "This is great. I'm glad you survived. I was worried," because she goes June 5th. I mean, she got a letter at some point in May, and that was the last letter she got from him. And she has nothing until August 22nd. Then eventually, she writes a letter because she eventually then receives the telegram that he's dead. And so she begins writing letters trying to figure out what happened to him. And he wrote letters to her mentioning everybody in the mortar squad of F Company 505th. And so she had some names to go on and she got some addresses. And so she wrote to them. And she wrote one to John Steele's mother. And that letter she wrote, I'm writing to obtain John Steele's overseas address. He and my husband were buddies in the same company. My husband, Sergeant John P. Ray, was reported wounded and then 3 months later declared dead. Through my brother-in-law who's in England, we've had news that your John was beside him when he was wounded, which I think is an important point. I'd like very much to write him and get all the particulars. Then eventually on September 18th, 1944, the date is important. She receives a letter from John Steele himself. And in that letter, he says, my dear Mrs. Ray, I'm writing to you. Hold on. Telephone coming. He wrote to her saying, I'm writing to you at the request of my mother who's been ill. We've all been pretty busy with the illness and a brother home from the Southwest Pacific for the first time in 3 years, trying to entertain him and such. We haven't heard from John for about a month. But he was okay then, out of the hospital and ready to go again. Oh, wait, no, I'm sorry. This is Vernon Steele, not John Steele. This is Vernon Steele, John Steele's father, writing to Paul Woodadge. We haven't heard from John in, we haven't heard from John for about a month, but he was okay out of the hospital and ready to go again after being wounded and captured by the Germans 2 days after D-Day, which is a weird point. Yeah. Captured by Germans 2 days after D-Day, but he got away from them. Then it goes on, eventually then on October 8th, 1944, Paul Woodadge in New Orleans, about 20 miles from my house, receives a letter from John Steele himself. And the letter reads, Dear Mrs. Ray, just received your inquiry as to John, meaning John Ray. As you know, censorship regulations prohibit the mentioning of casualties for a certain period of time. John's case was far different than average. We buddies of his received so many conflicting tales in the beginning and even up to September 15th about him. No doubt Stanley has got the true facts home by now, as he was up to our post just as we were leaving for Holland to recheck, at which time he went to our personnel office and was told that John had died of injuries received in Sainte-Mère-Église after having lived 7 days and was buried on the peninsula, which Stanley has the direct location of by coordinates. Yes, one of our boys did say that he had been in the field hospital with him, which is very likely. However, no doubt he surmised that John Ray had been put aboard the hospital boat for evacuation to England. Without a doubt, Stanley received the true facts of the case. Needless to say, it was quite a loss to me as well as his many other buddies in the outfit, and our deep felt sympathies go out to you and his family. It's my hope that after the war, I can get down to Cutoff, meaning Cutoff, Louisiana, the thriving metropolis of, and to see and talk with you and the Ray family. So until then, chin up, Mrs. Ray, and kindly remember me as one of John's buddies. Sincerely, John Steele. So that muddies the water now, doesn't it?
Yeah.
For a couple of reasons. First and foremost, I find it fascinating that the version of the John Ray story that he tells is very, very true and accurate, because as we now know, John Ray did not die right there at the church in Sainte-Mère-Église. Through the efforts of an historian named Brian Sedal, we now know that he survived until June 13th and that he ultimately perished as a result of gangrene. Yeah. So that he was shot and wounded in Sainte-Mère-Église, and then I was going to say lingered on. I'm going to use the word suffered on until ultimately his wounds took his life on June 13th. So John Steele provides us a version of the John Ray story that we know to be very accurate. We know it now, thanks to Brian Sedal's work. And then what does John Steele do when she has asked him to fill in information about what happened to John Ray? John Steele keeps kind of referring to Stanley, referring to this other soldier from the platoon. He's got the true facts. He can tell you there were people in the field hospital with him. And really what John Steele is saying is that I don't know. And what that does is I think that conclusively rules out this whole narrative built on the northwest corner. Because if he was on the northwest corner, looking down, he could have seen Ken Russell. He therefore could have been in a position to observe this incident that Russell describes, in that a soldier comes around and kills John Ray. So then that leaves us with the big question of, where was John Ray when he was killed? We don't know, and we're never going to know. Ken Russell describes it, but Ken Russell's version of the story is not situated on the north side of the church. It's situated on the south side of the church. He himself says, I was on the right side as you face the church. I think that leaves out entirely the possibility of the northwest corner. And I understand where Stuart's coming from with this. And Stuart, I appreciate the questions that you're asking and what you're interested in doing. And I appreciate also why you're asking the bigger question. Why? Why are we picking this story apart? And I'll tell you, the reason I started picking the story apart was because I was trying to move toward a single narrative that I could work with as a tour guide. That's why I started asking questions about this 10 years ago. That's why I began assembling this massive data set of information, because I was attempting simply to move from what was really a bunch of random, incoherent stories that would not reconcile at all with one another. I was trying to move from that to a single narrative. And I think it's interesting that after 10 years of trying, and I'm sure my effort hasn't been entirely perfect, but at this point, I feel like I've kind of had an advanced course on Normandy history and D-Day history. And after 10 years, I found nothing that has moved me really an inch closer to a singular narrative that I can work with. Because the Northwest Corner narrative doesn't work. The Ken Russell narrative on a couple of levels doesn't work. The movie narrative obviously has massive problems. I feel like we can just kind of push the movie narrative aside and just ignore it. Yeah. And the narratives that we can work with, that's the more important point here, is that we have some narratives that we can work with and some that we can't. I think we can eliminate the narratives that were created by historians who wrote secondary books. Let's just not use them, and let's not use the movie version. Yeah. And let's just go forward with what we have. And what we have is 12 words from John Steele that turned into 334 words from Cornelius Ryan. That to a certain extent, the Steele letter to Paula Guidry, the October 1944 letter, it underscores and supports some of that, and it complicates some of that. And I find it fascinating that here we are all this time later, and we still don't have, we can't really settle on a singular narrative, because we don't have any of this additional peripheral or adjunct proof that can support the traditionalized narrative that's in the movie. And we actually don't even have any of that to support the 12 words or the 334 words. And what we have are some significant complications. And
and if although we can eliminate the movie, we can eliminate some of the stuff, we are left with where we started this show with, is the counts we do have. You have to either pick one or the other one, because they don't connect. The sides of the church don't connect. The timings don't connect. The where they went, what they can see, because. And we've all added stuff to it, and the other authors added, they could see the fire, they couldn't see the fire. I've heard people say John Steele could see the arriving American troops coming in from Drop Zone O. Others say he could see the people in the fire. Same with Ken Russell. Well, wherever you are in the church, you only see kind of one set of 90 degrees. You can't see everything. So it all gets to be a problematic situation. So we've been at it for an hour and a half, which is, I knew we were going to be doing that. And what I think people are doing on YouTube, which is what I wanted to happen, is they're gradually honing in the idea that really what matters is other things in the Normandy campaign. And we've all been guilty, myself included. I'm going to put my hand right up and say I've done duff versions of the story there many times, trying to fit in for whatever reasons. And again, the subject of money has come up, in that we're, as tour guides, we have to make money. We have to make money. We have to to pay the bills, and you have to do a certain amount of popular stuff and talk about movies, because people will ask about it. And that's, none of us are eccentric millionaires where we do this entirely for fun. If it would be, I would be in the Falaise Gap all the time. I think I'd never get anywhere near it, whatever, But the other thing that's been coming up, a couple of people mentioned Scott Grimwood and other people, is that we are no way are we taking away the achievements of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions and the British 6th Airborne in what they achieved. They did get all the crossroads they needed, and the bridges and the causeways, and lots of men died in very tragic circumstances that morning. But what is interesting is that this story is fascinating, and I feel I don't want to talk about it again. But should we just mention, because on my list there we've got the von Keusken accounts as well, who some people may or may not be familiar with. He is a German historian who writes predominantly in German, obviously. Some of his stuff is available in French, and some of it has been translated into English, but not very much. And he did his books, 10 years, 15 years ago, I suppose now. And he, I suppose, to give him his credit, did try to clarify things, but I think he just muddied the water even more, and went with some other ideas. So what did he say basically about the whole church tower story and
fascinating
the bell tower story?
What von Keusken did is what basically Ambrose and Drez and Bernage and who is this guy? I just found this book today with references to it. This guy's book, his name is Derek Wills, Put on Your Boots and Parachutes. What von Keusken did was exactly what they all did, and that is that they went with Rudolf May and Rudy Escher, and they had to take those narratives, and just for the record, I am finding, as I'm beginning to track, I'm tracking an evolution of the way that the Rudolf May and Rudy Escher stories are being told. So that from the original source code, which Nils, by the way, was helpful with me earlier today. And we were trying to come up with what point do we first hear those two names, the two German names? And the earliest that we could come up with was 1993, which is significantly after the fact. And I feel like that it's worth pointing out that it's long after the fact.
Yeah.
There have been moments, because it's so far after the fact, and after all of the bad blood that I have had with veterans who lied to me. Just for the record, when I had a job with a museum for 10 years, during which time I did nothing but interview veterans, and I interviewed about 2,000 of them. And out of that, there were a couple dozen that were they misrepresented their service during the conflict. And they're bad apples that should not take anything away from the good apples, because there are a lot of good apples and a couple of bad apples. But in the last 15 years or so, I've dealt with some bad apples, and it made me gun shy, and it's made me skeptical.
Yeah.
And I have observed with some of these bad apples that one of the dynamics that made them begin exaggerating their stories was that they wanted attention in a world that wasn't paying attention to them. And that's in my mind when I read accounts that haven't emerged until long after, because maybe you've experienced this too. I certainly have. I have dealt with veterans that tell things as personal accounts that they saw in movies.
Yeah.
It hasn't happened much, but it's happened.
Well, we had that thing. I know some people were following me on Twitter. I'm going off on a tangent, but it's a relevant tangent. It was a professor of psychology, memory, how brains work. And he was telling an Australian journalist about this experiment they did where they invited people for a spurious set of interviews, 100 people. And forget what the actual circuit, the test was, they spoke to these people before going into this room and saying, so the hall's not open or something. We're standing around, we're filling in time, and it was in California. And while they were there, they said, "Anybody here been to Disney while you've been here in California?" And these people said, "Yeah, I've been to Disney." And some said, "I haven't been to Disney, so I'm going there tomorrow." And the interviewer said, the psychologist said, "Have any of you seen? Did any of you get a hug from Daffy Duck when you were there?" And it's important that we are talking about Daffy Duck, not Donald. And everyone sort of went, And they went and did this interview. And then a year later, they were all brought back, these people, for another reason. And again, the reason they pretended to have them there was inside the hall. But again, they are outside waiting to go in. And the same interviewer said to people, "Oh, we're here again a year later. Any of you been to Disneyland?" And people said, "Yeah." And 25% of the people referred to going to Disneyland and said they got a hug from Daffy Duck. And it's Donald Duck at Disney, not Daffy Duck. So this psychiatrist planted a thought in these people's idea in their heads, and 25% of them a year later added it to their own story. And I think that is very interesting in when people like because I've met lots of veterans or families of who said, oh yeah, my grandfather went through Sainte-Mère-Église, he saw the church, the parachute on the church tower. I think they're just adding this story years later from the movie, from everybody else. Rudy Escher and Rudolph May, they go there in the night. I'm with you, about the early 90s is the first time they turn up, by which time there is a mannequin on the church, everything's set up there, the John Steele restaurant, why they're all fitting into the story. Another thing I want to say about John Steele, and I'll go back to you again. I met people from Metropolis who knew John Steele years ago, and they said, and I don't want to say anything negative about John Steele, is he had no wife, he had not much of a life, and he looked forward, counting the days down to his annual visit to Normandy every single year, and as soon as he got here, it was the best week of his life, and he just ran with it, and he took advantage of it. And I have, as a human being, no problem whatsoever with a guy who served his country looking forward to getting a free trip to Normandy once a year. And if that meant just going along with the story and posing for photos, fine. I have no problem with it on that level, except that it leaves us now with this point that what can we trust and what can we trust?
Yeah. And this, for the record, this is not my personal opinion, but there are plenty of personal accounts from people that knew John Steele and dealt with John Steele who are quick to point out that he had a big personality, and he was very bold, and he was a storyteller, and the word showman was used. These are not my words, and these are not my opinions. These are what people wrote and remembered about John Steele. And considering that that's the case, I could see how a personality like that, when given this attention, would really come alive. And in case it hasn't been mentioned, he meets this very, very sad and unfortunate fate. The man is hospitalized during the last year of his life, and he ultimately succumbs to cancer, and he dies way too young.
Yeah.
I wish he had survived. God, I wish I could have met him. Of all the veterans I've met, I value every opportunity I had to talk with him, and I wish I could have met Steele. But his life ended within a week of when my life began. So I never got a chance to spend any time with him. And I'd love to hear his version of this story.
Yeah.
And I'm certainly not here taking anything away from it, but I'm here to make this core argument. That is that it might be just because I'm a tour guide that has had the experience of leading tours in Normandy in the post-Private Ryan Band of Brothers era. And that is that there was kind of a process of what I felt was superficialization, in that tour clients were very interested in being able to situate that experience with what they already knew, and what they already knew was those movies. Because I think Stuart and Sean and you and I, we're all guilty of one thing, is that is we spend a lot of time with other people who are published authors about D-Day. And that changes the way that we look at it. And it often resets me. It resets my barometer when I get around a tour group. And I realize that these people have watched Private Ryan, and they've watched Band of Brothers, and maybe they've watched Longest Day. And that's where it's all coming from. And it's my job to relate all of that to those movies. And I have, I'm not perfect, and I sometimes get snobby about it. And I sometimes go, I'm done talking about Band of Brothers, or I'm done talking about Private Ryan, especially Private Ryan. But at the same time, this is what these people know, and the stories are familiar, and it puts me in the odd circumstance of, I think like you, when I get into Sainte-Mère-Église, I'm always kind of like, oh, here we go again. Great. Because the way that day usually structures for me is wake up at hotel, go to Utah Beach, Dick Winters Memorial, Brickor Manor Memorial, Sainte-Mère-Église, and go over to what's the guy's name that owns this, that he doesn't own it anymore, the C-47 to get sandwiches. What was his name?
Elwood. Yeah, Elwood's place.
Yeah, Elwood's place. He doesn't own it anymore, I don't think. Anyway,
no.
Go to Elwood's place, get a sandwich, and then during the sandwiches at Elwood's C-47 Cafe, inevitably I'm being bombarded by questions from the tour guests about John Steele. And what I have found overwhelmingly is that when people come on the tours, they're there for a reason. And that reason is they can't get enough. They want every story I can give them. They want every insight into the real truth behind Band of Brothers, or this scene in Private Ryan was based on this. They can't get enough of all of that. And so what that leads to then is, and sort of a long rollout of the entire John Steele narrative, that It depends on how we're doing on the schedule. That depends on what version I tell them, because there are times that I go there, and even with all this information that I now have that makes me question almost everything about the traditional Assembly 1 version, even with all of that, I tell the movie version and then get on to what I want to do, because typically on that day, the afternoon is Lafayette, Coquigny, Glen. And that's not enough time to do those.
No.
And I want to get to it as fast as I can.
And I mean, another Brian Yee is watching this, who's a client of mine, become a friend, and he's had the dubious honor of sitting in the pub in Bayeux with me and Colin after touring and listening to us do this kind of shit. And, you know, he'd be the first to say, but you didn't do this kind of shit on the tour. And you go, yeah, because we've just spent an hour and a half doing this kind of shit over a beer, because you simply can't fit this stuff in. If people come there and their frame of reference is The Longest Day, they've read maybe Stephen Ambrose and they've read, I don't know, John Keegan or something, you just haven't got the time to unravel this story and go back to basics and start, okay, and do what we've just done over the last hour and a half. So you have to kind of pick a version, do it, and move on and kind of live with the guilt afterwards. But to bring things to an end, because we need to bring things in, although I have been enjoying it, we need to have some kind of resolution to this. So the resolution, I think, is, I'm going to speak first, I'll let you speak, is that there is no good physical, archival, or photographic evidence that there was a paratrooper or two on the church.
That's cool.
There is, however, these personal accounts that were people on the church that are problematic. It doesn't mean I'm not saying they're not true. I'm saying they're problematic, and I'm saying in the terms of how you structure an argument and how you do debate. The claim is, did John Steele or Ken Russell, or John Steele and Ken Russell land on the church? And I would say my conclusion is case unproven, not enough evidence. You know, we can't say they were there, but we can't say they weren't there either. We just have to say, you know what? Let's move on and talk about something else. Let's take people to Lafayette. Let's talk about Waverly Ray. Let's talk about De Glopper and all the other heroes there. But anything else you want to say there to any evidence we've missed talking about tonight? I think we've covered most of it.
We covered on. We didn't cover everything, but we can't. We would have been here for days to cover everything. A point I love to make about this is that when John Steele had the opportunity to tell this story and to tell it in writing, he told it with 12 words. And then he told another story with 94 words. And I think that tells you right there that to John Steele, this wasn't really a very big deal. It took a movie to make it a big deal. And I think John Steele responded to the fact that part of that movie centered on him and his experience, and he ran with that. I had the blessing in life of being raised by a 2-tour Vietnam veteran, and my father, in an understatement, did not exactly have a positive experience in the Republic of Vietnam the 2 times he went. It was a largely negative experience, and my father, I saw later in life that there was a period where nobody, just like World War II, there was a period where nobody wanted to talk about it, nobody was interested. And then there was a period where movies came out and people couldn't quit talking about it. And the movies were Full Metal, or Boys from Company C, Full Metal Jacket, and Platoon. And during that era, people would ask him questions that were related to the movie. And then he went back to Vietnam in 2009, and there were college students on that trip. And the way that they asked him questions told me a lot, helped me understand John Steele a lot more. Because what those students did is, in preparing for their trip to Vietnam, all they did was watch a couple of movies. And then they asked my father about killing civilians, burning villages, and fragging his officers. They asked him questions about the things that they saw in the movie. And I watched my father get kind of like, oh, for God's sake, where he was a little bit irritated by it, but he also wanted to give them what they wanted. They wanted to engage the subject. And he ended up just telling stories that were nothing like the stories that he told me when I was a kid. The stories he told me were unfiltered and raw and true. And the stories that he told the adoring fan crowd, they were funny stories about one night we were all drunk in Saigon, or we did this, or the food was bad, or I got a letter from home, or the captain had this dog that was so bothersome. He told funny stories that were like quips that were, unimportant. I'm mentioning it to emphasize this point. He became a performer. When he was around them, they expected a certain performance and he provided it. And I'm beginning to believe that that's exactly what John Steele did. To him, whatever happened to him that night on that church warranted what? 14 words. And there were other things that happened to him that were of far greater consequence in the way that he remembered his experience during the Second World War. And I kind of prefer to remember that. There's a mannequin there. That mannequin makes me deal with the story.
Yeah.
Because if I took a tour to Normandy and we passed through Sainte-Mère-Église and I didn't mention it, brother, there would be hell to pay. Yeah, I have to address it.
I was I forget who I was talking to. It was someone about Omaha, and the elephant in the room on Omaha Beach, and we've all stood there, Stuart hasn't stood, is that if you don't mention Saving Private Ryan, they will. So I do it, I get it done with. I say, okay, here's where the movie different, and I kind of think, like 5 minutes, and then I say, look, can we just go and talk about what happened there? Any other questions about that? Are we happy? Can we understand it's a movie? Let's move on. There are no houses in the movie, there's that. But you can't not mention it, and it's not Steven Spielberg's fault in any way at all that when he had the production meeting for that movie in 1995 or 6, whenever it was, before the movie was put into production, that every single person who ever went to Omaha Beach ever beyond then has Saving Private Ryan running through their head when they stand there, myself included. I can't help but have some of that when I'm telling a story. My brain is going through the visuals of Tom Hanks with a chewing gum and a mirror, even though I'm telling my brain, don't do that, brain, stop doing that. But visuals are very important. And I think the other thing that is going to be the fascinating about the Sainte-Mère-Église story is we are going to examine this story in 20 years' time, but not about John Steele. It's going to become a case study of how tourism worked from about 1960 up to about 2010, 2020, and how these stories just became, as we said right at the top of the show, bigger than what they started at. You know, it all came down to one guy in a church, when in fact there are 13,000 paratroopers and airborne soldiers who had many more interesting stories. But you get to the point where it's guy landed in the field, guy landed in the field, guy landed in a wet field, guy landed in the field near a wall, guy landed in the field near a cow. Then you go, oh, guy landed in a church tower. It immediately you go, oh, as we said at the beginning, that sequence in the film is spellbinding, and it will always be spellbinding. So there we are.
And isn't it wonderful that we have that? And isn't it fantastic that Cornelius Ryan decided to write that book, and that Darryl F. Zanuck decided to turn it into a movie? And even though he made this big, what I think sometimes was a bit of a god-awful mess, we're still talking about it, and it's more than 50 years later. And isn't that fantastic? Because at least it gets people interested and people talking about this subject. Because if that movie hadn't been made, you know, maybe there's an arguable case that D-Day would have been a popular subject regardless. But yeah. I lead tours to the Gulf of Salerno, and I take people to sites associated with the Salerno invasion of September 43, and nobody cares. They are so uninterested. It's amazing.
That's the thing. I mean, I did a show last night with Alex Kershaw talking about the Liberator and the events in January in the Vosges Mountains. Yeah. And it was good, and Alex was on form, and it was great. We got a third of the views live that this show has got. But I'm hoping that some people who've obviously found us because of tonight, there's some newbies, some names I don't recognize in the comments, and that's just the comment. There's other people watching it will go, hey, that's interesting. I wonder if they'll come back and they'll do a show about Neuville-Lauplan or Fauville or the Medal of Honor and Distinguished Service Cross Actions or whatever it would be in Normandy. Yes, we will bloody well do that stuff. We will come and do that again. And it's like, I was talking to my friend Neil Story, who's a World War I and crime historian in Norfolk. I've known Neil for 30 years. And he's a ripperologist as well.
Nice.
Writes about Jack the Ripper. And I remember he was sitting in my house last year before, and I said, so what's the worst thing that could happen to you as a ripperologist? And he said, someone proving definitively who Jack the Ripper is.
The worst thing that could happen.
But don't you want to know that? No, because it ends all the books, it ends all the discussions, and it ends all the interest. And I think that's the purpose. Whether we like the John Steele story or not, it is a hook. It is that thing that begins discussion, and the fact that people have been sitting and enduring us talking for nearly 2 hours is the hook that I hope people will start learning a bit more and trying to go out. So and also I wanted to say earlier, when we started talking about this story, Stuart, me, you, we were in our 30s. We're all in our early 50s, late 40s now. I've got much more grumpy and much more cynical and skeptical as I get older, and it's made me a better understander of military history now than I was when I was 37. I'm just a little bit more, yeah, you're going to prove this to me first, mate. I'm a bit, when I get the book, I start with my arms folded. It's like, yeah, okay, you've got to win me over now.
A high bar now. Yeah.
The bar is higher, and I'm better for it. I'm better that I can read a book and go, you know what, that was crap, and I just put it on the shelf and I go, yeah, forget that one, or I give it away. But anyway, it has been extraordinary. I've really enjoyed this. You know, it's we could go round and round doing it, but yeah, the bottom line is case is still unproven. I wish we could have that smoking gun that definitively says he was or wasn't there. But so you can't, as we said, you can't disprove a negative. You can only prove he was there. We can't ever prove he wasn't there. Because, yeah. Anyway, thank you very much for watching, folks. And of course, I had request to have Marty on again. I'm sure we'll have Marty. We might do Point to Hawk one day. That would be that'd be an interesting one. And get death threats from Rangers. I don't know, but well, we won't. But for those watching, it's DDay tomorrow with David O'Keefe, another fine historian who has rewritten the history books with regards to what the purpose of the DDay raid was. So we did part 1 where we discussed the real reason we had the raid. Tomorrow we're going to discuss the plan as intended for the raid on DDay, and then a third show when lockdowns and shit are over, we're going to actually take the cameras to DDay and talk about what happened on the day. But anyway, thank you for watching. Don't forget to click subscribe. Don't forget to check out our Patreon page and check out Marty's work on the internet and his tours. And when we start touring again, you can tour with me or Stuart or Sean or Stuart or the other people who are watching this. Thank you very much, Marty. That was all right, wasn't it? I don't think we're going to get any angry letters about that. I think we were fairly responsible and polite.
Yeah, I think so. And I'm just glad that you provided the opportunity to discuss this, because any discussion about the D-Day invasion is something I'm going to be interested in.
Exactly. So that's it then, folks. It's beer o'clock now. Might be single malt o'clock. I think I've deserved it tonight. Frankie's sitting there. Was that Frankie? Was that the other?
This is Bebop. I wanted to say hi to Sean, so there he is.
My two cats are behind me. Anyway, good. Thank you very much for watching, folks. I will see you all again very shortly tomorrow with DDay. So thanks for watching. See you again on WW2TV.